The Port Authority Bus Terminal. It's not only the nation's largest bus terminal, it's the world's busiest. Well, I'm not going to investigate that claim today, but I want to look at the amazing piece of transportation infrastructure that allows the terminal to serve so many buses. The exclusive bus lane, or XBL, that runs 2.5 miles from the New Jersey Turnpike through the Lincoln Tunnel to the Port Authority. Also, I have some more general thoughts about vehicular tunnels and how they interface with cities, and it's up next. This is City Nerd, weekly content on cities and transportation. So I was in New York last month, but before I headed out, I put a call out on the Bird app for ideas on things I should go film for a future video. Justin, lowercase with a period, suggested the Lincoln Tunnel. Well, Justin actually had a lot of ideas. He's a good follow, by the way. So backing up a little further, pretty much every time I research a video, I learn something that just kind of blows my mind. And in this case, it was one of my earliest videos where I looked at the busiest bridges and tunnels in the US, which going into it, I thought they were all gonna be like subway or commuter rail tunnels, or bridges like the Manhattan or the Williamsburg that also carry trains. Because, you know, rail lines are much higher capacity than bus lines. So when I looked in the data and saw the Lincoln Tunnel carries more AM peak hour trips by bus than any of the 3 commuter train connections to Manhattan carries, I was pretty floored. Now, there are lots of ways you can get from New Jersey across the Hudson and into Manhattan. You can drive or bike or walk across the George Washington Bridge, or drive through the Lincoln or the Holland tunnels. You can take a train into Penn Station. You can take a PATH train into Lower Manhattan or Midtown. You could take a number of ferries that'll dock all over Manhattan, or you could take a bus, and that usually means the Port Authority Midtown Bus Terminal. And it turns out, even with all those other travel options, the humble Port Authority Bus Terminal handles a whopping 23% of all Trans-Hudson trips on weekdays. So let's do some quick historical review and figure out how we got here. Around 1940, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia was looking to rationalize the commuter and interstate bus system. There were 8 separate bus terminals scattered all over Midtown. The system was a bit chaotic. So he asked the Port Authority to come up with a solution to consolidate all the Midtown operations at one location. That location, a single block bound by 40th Street, 41st Street, 8th Avenue, and 9th Avenue, opened in 1950 and has since gone through several expansions and updates. And look, I gotta be honest, I've been to New York more times than I can count, but I'd never once set foot in the Port Authority until this most recent trip when I wanted to film. I mean, the standard tourist advice is basically avoid. And yeah, it isn't beautiful, and there's nothing about it that's a tourist draw. It's a workhorse for locals. But the whole way the Port Authority exists in the popular imagination just seems kind of classist. Like, you don't want to rub shoulders with those people. It's kind of a microcosm of how much respect, or lack thereof, we have for bus riders in this country. But Manhattan, more than any place in the US, depends on being able to get an enormous workforce onto the island every day. And the Port Authority is a critical piece of that. Okay, another piece of background. Keeping up with demands has been a constant theme of the bus terminal. And in 1970, the Port Authority came up with an innovative plan to increase bus throughput into the terminal and keep buses from getting stuck in traffic. A 2-mile exclusive bus lane, or the XBL, was constructed on the approach from the New Jersey Turnpike along Route 495 and through the Lincoln Tunnel to the bus terminal, serving eastbound buses during the 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. weekday peak period. And today, the XBL is hands down the highest capacity highway lane in the US, carrying around 1,850 buses in the 4-hour AM peak period, or around 70,000 passengers. Now, I want to go through some of the nuts and bolts of how the XBL operates, but first, one thing you hear sometimes is that all these commuter buses should really just be trains, and the fact that the XBL is so busy is really just kind of a policy failure. But I would just suggest you take a moment to consider how difficult it is politically to repurpose a general travel lane on an extremely constrained corridor like Route 495 Lincoln Tunnel. For an elected official, that's really sticking your neck out in a way that elected officials rarely do. And you just wonder, given today's political environment, if the XBL didn't already exist, would you even be able to implement it today? Just food for thought. So let's walk through how the XBL works. And as we go through this, I'm going to use some video from the YouTube channel Timosha21. I don't know how you pronounce it, but Tim, who runs the channel, has lots of super interesting video that's basically just unedited transit rides. It's a bit like ASMR for transit junkies, and he was cool with me using his video from the XBL. So thanks to Tim, and definitely go check out his channel. I left a link down in the description. At the West End, the XBL begins with an interesting piece of roadway geometry called the teardrop. The teardrop collects bus traffic coming from the New Jersey Turnpike northbound, the Turnpike southbound, and Route 3 eastbound. From the teardrop, it moves into the exclusive bus lane, which is a contraflow that runs in what's normally the leftmost of the 3 westbound lanes on Route 495. In the aerial, you can see the special yellow lane lines, but Tim's video gives you a good view of the wands that get installed and removed each weekday morning. Approaching the tunnel, we go through what's called the helix, and then the XBL is threaded into the left lane of the 2-lane reversible center tube of Lincoln Tunnel. As we go through the tunnel, you can see that both the bus lane and the general purpose lane are moving at about the same speed, and you could probably do a bit of math in your head and realize there's a huge difference in person throughput between these 2 lanes. Exiting the tunnel on the Manhattan side, the buses have a dedicated lane that takes them a block north on Dyer Avenue, then onto a series of ramps that connect to different levels of the terminal. And you can see in Tim's video that this is where the bottleneck of the whole system currently is. It's the capacity of the terminal itself to get the buses into their gates. I'll talk more about that, but first let's just consider the amount of infrastructure you need to disperse the other 3 lanes of general traffic. Because this is always the issue with tunnels. It's great that you're underground and separated from surface traffic, but at some point you have to resurface and interface with the grid. You're gonna hit a traffic signal where you might be lucky to get 50% of the signal cycle. So really, you need a massive amount of approach lanes and queue storage to match the throughput of the tunnel. And if traffic is gridlocked on the surface, which has been known to happen, you're not even going to be able to use all that green time. Urban traffic is super complex, and that's kind of the beauty of the bus terminal and its ramps. You have no signals and you have connections directly into the Port Authority. Let's talk a bit about the services that use the XBL. There are over 100 providers, but the workhorse is New Jersey Transit's bus service. New Jersey Transit runs about 60 different bus lines through the XBL and into the Port Authority. The busiest is Route 128 from North Bergen, which currently runs 43 buses in the 8 a.m. hour alone. That's almost a bus a minute. But several other New Jersey Transit lines run buses into the Port Authority every 4 minutes or better. So it's my understanding that the bus terminal itself is now at capacity in peak hours. That is, the schedules for New Jersey Transit and other providers are maxed out, not because of roadway congestion, but due to limitations on circulation, staging, and berths available for boarding and alighting at the terminal. The Port Authority has declared that the terminal is quote unquote functionally obsolete. It's failing to keep up with demand, but also the structure and the geometry of the terminal itself don't permit the use of articulated or double-decker buses, which would also improve the efficiency of the system. Before I get to more about constraints, future plans for the bus terminal, and more thoughts about how traffic tunnels do or do not work well for cities, quick pause to remind you to give the video a like or subscribe if you haven't done so already. It does help support the channel. There is a Patreon now if you want to support the channel more directly and get access to occasional bonus material. And thanks to everyone who's signed up already. Sub count check. The channel now has enough subscribers to fill Fenway Park. I said enough about Fenway in my Urbanist Ballparks video, and if there's one thing I learned from that, it's that Chicagoans do not like finishing second. So my advice to those people is start your own YouTube channel with an alternate reality where Chicago just has the best of everything. Episode 1, why we insist on mistaking a goopy casserole for a pizza. So let's talk a little bit about future plans for the Port Authority. There was a Trans-Hudson commuting capacity study back in 2016 that took a holistic look at demands and constraints for commute trips into Manhattan from New Jersey. It's got this really interesting figure that color codes the mode for each commuter based on 5-year American Community Survey data. Each dot is one commuter, and it really shows how the subway, which is green here, is dominant in New York City itself, along with the PATH train in Hoboken and Jersey City. Regional rail in blue is dominant on Long Island and in Westchester County, which is what you'd expect. But it's really a mix in New Jersey. You can see a lot of close-in areas are not well served by rail, and the bus in yellow is dominant in some places. The report also shows a forecast need for 40% more peak hour capacity at the bus terminal by 2040. Forecasting is hard though, and the study acknowledges those numbers may not even correctly account for existing latent demand. New Jersey Transit staff have said they would already be adding more service if peak hour capacity existed at the terminal. Meeting a 40% increase in demand would also require capacity improvements for the XPL. Some of it would be achieved by accommodating higher capacity vehicles, but another idea the capacity study floats is coordinated adaptive cruise control that would shrink following distances and support tight bus platooning. I'm pretty sure I was told that technology was going to be rock solid like 5 years ago, so forgive me for not holding my breath. The Port Authority has begun the NEPA process to replace the terminal. I'm not going to give you a bunch of planning speak about purpose and need or goals and objectives or no builds and alternatives analysis. If you care, I've got a link to the most recent documentation down in the description. The short version is the locally preferred alternative is a replacement structure on the same footprint, but also a new intercity bus terminal, reconfigured ramps, and space for revenue-generating private development. Hey, you gotta pay those bonds back somehow. There's no timeline for the replacement yet, and even if the space-age looking platooning bus technology shows up at some point, it isn't gonna alter the laws of physics or the geometric properties that determine how many buses Port Authority Bus Terminal can accommodate at one time. So, sorry, North Bergen, it looks like you're just going to be stuck with a paltry 43 buses in the peak AM hour. I think the lesson here is having a tunnel with high-tech vehicles in it is all well and good, but it doesn't meaningfully change the traffic situation if the capacity constraint is at the end of the tunnel. That's all I've got. Thanks for joining, and special thanks for the patrons who got on board this week. Keep the great topic suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new episode next week, and I'll see you then.